is real.
In this episode of Curious Explorers, Kathy and I discuss none other than legendary parapsychologist Hans Holzer. And if the name sounds familiar to you, it should. He's well known for exploring everything from witchcraft and magic to ghosts and hauntings. He's worked with well-known mediums, and he explored famous haunting sites like the Whaley House, the Morris Jumel Mansion, and much more. And perhaps you've read one of his 120 books on these topics and much more. So if you're curious, stay tuned. Hi, Kathy.
Hey, Traci, how you doing?
I'm doing okay, thanks. I'm laughing because I'm still on edge, wondering if we're going to have any weird stuff happen during our session today.
We can only hope. We can only hope. We see these things differently. I'm like this, and you're like, no, please, no.
Can you see my candles behind me?
I can.
Can you see that one says, make today your bitch? I hope we don't get the explicit rating now.
Yeah,
I hope the ghost isn't like, all right, yeah. And then the other one is a protection candle. Let's see what happens.
And I have nothing to protect me here.
Other than your...
I have Zoltar. So, and I will say this, I did not unplug Zoltar. So if at any time he starts speaking, it's going to be because something has walked past him, because it is motion activated and there's nothing in here. And the dogs that caused all the ruckus last week are safely on the third floor, although they are still very anxious to participate. So we don't know. But if Zoltar starts talking, note that's because something in here has set him off and not something
floated by.
Yes.
I hope it happens.
I do too. You're like, I hope it happens because it's there. And I'm like, I hope it happens because I'm here. You know, he does scare me. Though. I mean, not scare me. It does startle me from time to time because he's unexpected. Yeah. All right. So I thought we could do something that's a little bit of a palate cleanser this week. The last couple of weeks, we've done some heavy stuff, and this is not lighthearted by any stretch of the imagination, but it's not in and of itself demonic. So I thought,
okay, that's a good to mix it up.
Yeah, you know, I mean, so I thought we would talk a little bit about Hans Holzer.
Yay!
For those of you who are paranormalists, that name is going to come as something you're very familiar with. Hans Holzer was a very well-known, I would say, public and popular paranormalist. He would have called himself a ghost hunter. He actually wrote a book called Tales of the Ghost Hunter. He wrote 119 other books as well, so he was extremely prolific. He passed away in 2009. So let's talk a little bit about his life and his legacy. And for a lot of people, Hans Holzer is the doorway through which they got interested in the paranormal. And yeah, I mean, and kind of was, for lack of a better way of looking at it, he was the introduction that a lot of people, particularly in the United States, had to even the idea of the paranormal versus ghost stories, right? So before Hans Holzer, even though there were definitely paranormal investigators, they called themselves, they called themselves ghost hunters. He was the first one that in the United States kind of took it to a different level and approached it from at least the perception of a scientific methodology. I'm going to say at the end of this, we'll talk about that and we'll see whether or not that's still, if it's still seen that way. But regardless, he was on television a lot. He's what I would have called an infotainer. So he would go on television with a lot of information, but was also an entertainer and understood that the subject matter, in order for it to be palatable to the public, had to also be told in a very entertaining way. And I think he just kind of had that vibe. I think he was a bit of like a lounge singer for paranormalists. He enjoys it.
That's exactly how I would have just, no, I wouldn't.
I don't know. It was kind of like that, So, I am going to start with his his early work, or actually just start with his early history. So he was born in January of 1920. And as I said, he lived to 2009. So he lived a very long life. He was born in Austria. He was absolutely, almost immediately, he had an interest in the paranormal and in ghost stories. And so he became one of the most important paranormal researchers of the 20th century, following in the footsteps of people that I would say like Harry Price, Nandor Fodor. Those names, again, for kind of hardcore paranormalists are going to be well known. For the more casual, maybe not, but definitely worth a Google and definitely worth something. Traci and I will talk about, and I'm sure their names will come up during the course of Curious Explorers.
Did you almost say Kathy and I?
I did. I almost said Kathy and Traci because I look at us as, we're like Cher. We don't need surnames, and I refer to myself in the third person.
Oh my God, that is hilarious.
Hans Holzer, the lounge singer. I'm more like, I'm a guru.
Bono.
Yeah, exactly. I'm Cher. I'm Bono.
A one-name wonder.
Taylor. We don't need anything to follow up for you to know who we are. So he was born in Vienna, in Austria, in 1920. He had an uncle who used to tell him ghost stories. Right? The best kinds of uncles. And for my nieces and nephews, the best kinds of aunts. And he would regale him with these stories of ghost stories, of spooks, of specters, vampires, werewolves, all manner of things. And Holzer actually researched all of those. But it developed his curiosity. And he spent his teen years kind of diving into the spiritual traditions of different cultures. He was a very smart kid, and he was expected to do great things. He was Austrian, so his family was middle class, and so he was expected, I would say upper middle class, I should say that. He was expected to kind of move on and do great things, and that he was supposed to pursue academics very, very stringently, and he did. But he didn't follow it in quite the way most people would. Right from his early studies, he studied at the University of Vienna. He moved to the United States in 1938, so right before World War II. And in the United States, he earned a doctorate in psychology from the London College of Applied Science. Now, he immediately started looking at paranormal subjects and spiritualism and spiritism, which are two different things. And we'll talk about those probably in a later state. But if I use them interchangeably, I'm in error. So mostly he would have looked at things that were spiritualist. But his credentials, because it was World War II and because he did a lot of correspondence education, skeptics and a lot of people who don't think much of Holzer would attack his credentials throughout his career. But there's it is true that he did receive a doctorate, and he did the work to receive a doctorate. And I do not have a doctorate, but my good friend Dr. Traci Stein does, and she can tell you how difficult and kind of all-consuming the pursuit of that is. So his career as a paranormal researcher spanned almost 6 decades. He claimed to be the first person to approach ghost hunting in a systematic way. I don't know that that's really true. I do think that he was the first person to utilize media and to utilize different types of technology, but only because he was there at the forefront of that technology. So he was born in 1920. The ghost hunters who were before him, or the paranormal investigators who were before him, might not have had radio, might not have had magnetic tape, and certainly wouldn't have had the ability to be mobile with those things, but he was. He was very interested. He wrote lots of different books, and a lot of his books were related not only to ghosts and hauntings and folklore, but also to witchcraft and magic and how these things interacted with historical figures. Hans Holzer is not a person that I would call terribly skeptical. I think that he had a profound belief in what he was doing, which is not to say that he didn't apply skepticism to the cases that he worked on. But he was fully willing to believe. He did not go in with the intention of debunking things. He did not go in with the intention of disproving things. He went in with the intention of finding evidence to support the experiences that people were having. for those of you who've read his books, he was also a really good storyteller. He told a lot of, he managed to make the stories feel like you were reading something scientific or something very forensic.
So, Kathy, I have a question for you.
Okay.
You were just talking about Hans Holzer, and, he was many things, but a very prolific author. And I have a book, one of his books somewhere. It's one of the giant ones. I can't remember what.
It's called Ghost.
Is it that one? Like I haven't looked at it.
But that's the smaller one, and it says Ghost on the front. It's like 800 pages long or something like that.
Yeah, it's like this weighty tome, and it basically, I was wondering how you must have some of his books for sale in the store. I'm wondering how many books you actually have.
I don't know how
you probably don't have 119.
I don't, and most of them are not in print anymore, or they're out of copyright. But I would say his family probably maintained the copyright because his daughter is still very much involved in the paranormal world. So that's kind of what her career has been as well. But they are out of print, and they go in and out of print.
Okay.
I do have. I have his witchcraft book, which he has another, which is very similar to Ghost Encounters, which is this massive kind of encyclopedic study or presentation of witchcraft cases. The Ghost Encounters is interesting because they're all his cases. So these are places that he went, places that he researched. He was fairly prolific, and when he presented a case for writing, he understood who was going to be reading it. So he wrote very well. And the witchcraft book is equal to that if you're interested in that subject matter. The other books are smaller, but he did a lot of like Tales of a Ghost Hunter and, Tales of a Parapsychologist and things like that. There's people who claim that he made the claim that he coined the phrase ghost hunter, but that's not true. Before he even really was writing, Harry Price had already been using that word. I would say he is the first person to use television media to kind of advance, his career, the public's knowledge as far as paranormal studies, but also to get access to locations that were purportedly haunted. He was the type of person that if you had a location that was purported to be haunted and you were interested in having other people know about it, you got Hans Holzer in. He was definitely the Zach Baggins of his day. He was the cream of there. He spent a lot of time on doing morning shows and Merv Griffin and things like that. I would say he was fairly well known. Oh, but as far as the number 100%. Of books, I don't have nearly as many. I don't have nearly as many as I wish I did.
Super quick aside. Oh, I don't want to interrupt.
No, go ahead. No, please.
So years and years ago, I did it as an aside. This, I forget, it was 5 days or 7 day past life regression training with Dr. Brian Weiss, who has made that very popular. But then there was some other thing, I believe, with Brian Weiss. I forget this woman's name who did a whole book on children's past lives. I think her last name is Bowman. It escapes me now. But Hans Holzer was one of the people who spoke. But this might have been in 2004 or 5. Right. So he was just in a completely different place in his life. You could see that things had changed for him, and it wasn't probably what his presentations used to be years ago. Right. But I had been fangirling over, oh my God, I'm going to see. It was right up front. You're 100% right. He is a legend. And even as a kid, I remember my parents had a few books of his, and that's how I became familiar with him, because he, remember everybody, there was no internet then. So, his books were, the fact that they were in average people's houses is pretty amazing.
And I mean, he stepped into Reader's Digest, Life magazine. So he was somebody that was acceptable to the mainstream, for fringe subjects. So when you had Hans Holzer on, or you wrote about Hans Holzer, you felt the mainstream media felt comfortable doing that because he didn't come off like a kook, right? And he had certain bona fides, right? So he came across as intelligent, urbane. He also had this great accent. You know what I mean? Like, and he had a doctorate, which is a big deal. And so because he didn't, he looked a certain part. He looked very scholarly. You know, he had the jackets, the tweed jackets with the patches on the elbows. He knew exactly what he was doing with regard to that. But that also was who he was. So because he had the degree and because he had kind of the gravitas of his background, he advanced paranormal research. And when you say he was kind of a superstar, he was for that reason. And that whether you go back and you look at his work and you say, well, I believe that, or I don't believe that, I'm suspect of that, or whatever, you do that because he afforded you the opportunity to do that. So you need to remember that where we are in paranormal studies right now, we're there because people like Hans Holzer kind of blazed a path. And while you may be able to go back and nitpick his research, you're only able to do that because he did that research when nobody else was really doing it. And he did it in such a way that made the subject matter mainstream. Hans Holzer was in TV Guide. Hans Holzer was in Reader's Digest. Reader's Digest was on every coffee table in Middle America. And so the work that he did blazed the trail for a lot of the people who are, and a lot of filmmakers. I mean, you'll talk to lots of people in different fields, and they'll say, this is the guy that kind of got me interested, because not only did he make it okay, but he actually supplied you with data and stories to indulge your passion. He wrote 120 books. Dude did his heavy lifting. He did a lot for it.
Without AI.
Yes, without
he actually
AI.
Had to write the words down.
And you got the feeling he liked to, right? So his style of investigation was different, I think, than what a lot of people would do now. He did use equipment. He absolutely did record. He didn't record for EVP or anything like that. He recorded so that he would be able to go back and reference it and have this evidence. In most cases, if he was going into a haunted location, he would bring in a psychic medium and he would record the phenomena that happened or the data that they got. And he worked with a few different ones. One of the most famous was Ethel Johnson Myers, who's a very well known. I think Sybil Leek was another one that he worked with.
Oh wow!
And if you read the books, you know that he was always he was not afraid to drop names. You know, he knew the value of what he was doing and saying, these are the people that I'm working with. And so he did coin one phrase, though, and I do use it. I don't see a lot of other people using it, but I do use it. He believed that earthbound spirits, which he referred to as ghosts. So ghosts were not necessarily spirits. Ghosts were a stage that a spirit went through. So you were living. And then if you passed away and you didn't move on to another plane or elevate to another plane, you were a ghost. And ghosts he called the addle-brained dead. So in other words, they were people in spirit form, people in non-corporeal people who had suffered some kind of psychological break that they could not then move on to. So it wasn't really a choice for them. So if they were a ghost and they were here, it's because they had some kind of a psychological break. And
I want to just say
I'm sorry. No, go ahead.
You were making me think as you talked about the addle-brained dead and people who were ghosts and didn't move on because of some sort of trauma. You know, for people, again, who aren't familiar with Hans Holzer's work, think about it as like if you've seen the movie The Others with Nicole Kidman,
exactly.
And how this entire family is unaware that they have passed on and the living are able to perceive. Oh, sorry. I didn't know you were going to get to that. It's telepathy. Yeah.
If you haven't seen it, it's your fault.
Is it 30 years old? Oh my God.
It's 99.
It's not new.
26.
Oh my God.
It's 26 years or 20.
Oh my God.
It's a great movie. And I actually think it's one of the best movies. I think
it is still good.
I think it truly, in my experience, it truly illustrates what I have been told in my experiences. So, and I would not argue I mean, I think addle-brained dead is kind of a mean
nice.
phrase. It's not nice,
Yeah.
but I think he's making a point here, which is kind of a layman's point, which is that ghosts are not elevated spirits. They're people, you know, in our day, they're just people struggling with emotional issues, trauma related emotional issues. And I think if you do read his book, and I encourage everybody to read his book, I do think all of his cases have that. You know, all of the cases that he presents have that. He doesn't lean a lot into residual stuff. Almost all of his cases are personal and personality driven. He was involved in lots of famous cases. So I thought we'd go through a couple of those. A lot of people don't know this, but Hans Holzer was one of the first investigators of the Amityville case. He investigated kind of secondhand. He did believe, and he did investigate after the famous after the information came out. So the book is published and everybody's going hog wild. So he wasn't one of the earlier investigators that went in before the book became a bestseller and kind of just saw the house. He went in after all the stories were out. He was the first one to claim that the house was haunted by spirits of native peoples who had lived on the land and who were angry, and that it was the psychic trauma of the collective that was there. I will say, in the case of Amityville, that did get picked up in the second book, and it was picked up by subsequent investigators. Although whether they picked it up from having read his work or picked it up from other investigations, not clear. It's hazy as to whether or not there's any factual evidence that native cultures lived on that land. My favorite Hans Holzer case, though, is he was an investigator of the Whaley House in San Diego. And the Whaley House, to me, is one of those pantheon of haunted houses in the United States. It was haunted before people were even interested in talking about ghosts. It was famously haunted before people wrote stories about ghosts. It was just its history as a haunted house is so well documented and so much a part of the lore that when I see the Whaley House, I don't even know that there's another place that is akin to it as far as how legitimate I consider this haunting. Now, I was very fortunate. I went to the Whaley House a couple of years ago, so I was very excited. It was very much like you visiting Hans Holzer. Me walking into the Whaley House was like, I don't know, like a devout Catholic going to the Vatican or something along those lines. I was like, oh.
Did you experience anything there?
I did not. I did experience something though in another location in that town. I would say the Whaley House was, it's now presented exclusively as a haunted location. So it's less of a historic location, more of a haunted location. I feel like I was just too excited. I was so excited to be there. I was so familiar with the stories. I was, and what was really compelling to me, because we will definitely talk about the Whaley House because it's a great story, but it's the story of one family, and it's very personal. It's very intimate. And the things that happened were very personal, very intimate, but it also is the story of this particular location when it was essentially the Whaleys built this house and built a courtroom in their house with the understanding that the county seat would be in this place. It devolved into a big argument and whatnot, but there was at least one person who was convicted and hanged there. In fact, the anniversary of his hanging is in 3 days. And I know
to be the only person to know that.
No,
I don't even think the historians at the Whaley House are like, oh, what's coming up?
I'm like, oh, Yankee Jim was hanged in September. It's almost that. So was Yankee Jim. But so this was one of those cases that Holzer did where he did it he knew the story. He'd gone in. He had found evidence of the haunting. He didn't generally go in for private events at this point in his life. He was really going into these larger places that they were going to be, kind of internationally known as a haunted location. So he wasn't going in to assist a family. And that was very rarely what he did. He wasn't really going in because families were troubled by things. He was going in because he heard the place was haunted and the family allowed him to come in. And then if he was able to kind of assist, but he didn't really look at it as something that he needed to move people on. He looked at it more along the lines of evidence of the survival of personality after death, and that in and of itself was a worthy pursuit. And, I agree with him. But he went on, Regis Philbin had a local show in Los Angeles. And I'm actually veering off of the script here a little bit, but it is a great story. So, and Regis Philbin's on record with regard to this. So this was long before Regis and Kathy Lee and Regis and Kelly. But Regis Philbin was a personality, and he had a local show. It was he had a radio show, but he also had a television show. And he had Hans Holzer on, and Holzer, had entertained him, and Regis said, I've actually heard of this place, this Whaley House, and tell us more stories about it. So Holzer did, and then subsequently, Regis Philbin went out to investigate it by himself, and he brought with him. He was interested in the subject matter, and he brought with him a friend. Regis Philbin was in the Navy, and he brought with him a friend who was a Marine. And Philbin was like, I was in the Navy, and I'm a diminutive guy, but I was still brave, and I still wanted to see what was going on. He goes, and I brought my Marine friend, who was a big, strapping recruit, and this was a guy, I think he'd been in the Marines. I think he was a career guy. So he'd been in the Marines for at least 15 or 20 years. And this was in probably 1960. So it's post World War II. And he said they went in, his Marine friend thought it was all baloney, and they actually both saw something. And he said 50 years later, he told the story and essentially was like, it changed my life. The experience changed my life. The experience changed his, and that's a rarity to have people come out very hardcore on this side of it. People will come out and say, well, I'm open-minded. Very rarely will well-known people come out and say, nope, I was convinced. And he did. And he did that because Hans Holzer went on his show and told the story and essentially said, this is how you investigate. This is how you do it. And that's the value, that's the effect and the impact that Holzer had, especially he wasn't just selling books. He was selling this phenomena. He was selling this as a pursuit. He wanted people to be interested in the subject matter, not just so that they bought his books, but because he thought it was a worthy pursuit. And I think that there's a distinction there. This is a guy that was, look at it as like an artist. An artist doesn't necessarily paint his or her work to sell. They're glad when it does, but they paint their work because they have to. And I think that's very close to what Hans Holzer was. He did try to, be scientific, and the way that he did that was by utilizing as much modern technology that was available at the time. So he recorded, he had note takers. He did bring in, he would have a dictaphone and whatever was the more advanced technology at the time. He was very interested in it. That's still not a laboratory setting. And as you and I have talked in the past, you're not going to put these things in a laboratory setting. So, but he wanted to create the perception that this was a field that could be taken out of folklore and out of simply storytelling and be put into a little bit more rigid methodology. And I think he tried to do that. I think he tried to the degree he would not allow the rigidity of his methodology to impact his willingness to have the data come in whatever way the data was going to come in. So, he didn't tie down his mediums. He tried to put it, I mean, Houdini did, the Society for Psychical Research did, because they were very much trying to make sure that there could not be any shenanigans,
like trickery. Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, because there were people doing that, but Holzer just essentially tried to do as much common sense stuff as possible, you know, and because he used people that he was comfortable with and over decades, there was a trust between them. And he just had a presumptive trust with his audience as well. And I think he did, you know, I think he did. So some of his books were Ghosts I've Met, you know, and he did look at these ghosts as like, you know, people that he interacted with. And if you've read the book, it's very conversational. He's not really pushing for evidence. You know, he's pushing for communication, and that's different. So he wasn't like, oh, you know, what's the date and what happened on this date? Like, he wasn't looking for evidentiary data. He was really looking to start a dialogue. And when you read it, it comes very much along like he's interviewing them versus trying to extract something that was, you know, something that could be traced back to a newspaper article or a photograph or something like that.
I think that's what makes it compelling too, is because I actually believe he was telling his truth.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that he recorded what the mediums came up with and his own findings, like in real time. I don't know, like to me, like even if he were a novelist, which he wasn't to my knowledge, you know, it would be compelling. It would be a compelling read.
Oh, absolutely.
I remember being just really drawn in.
I would say, so I opened in 2008 and Holzer died in 2009. And I remember somebody coming in here. And the first thing I had that book. I had many, many copies of that book because I think one of the larger publishers had just re-released it. And largely because the show Ghost Hunters had come on the air, was very, very popular. And the producers of Ghost Hunters will tell you that a huge inspiration for them was Hans Holzer, right? So I don't think that there's anyone from a certain time period that would not say that Hans Holzer was a major influence on, if not their interest, then certainly on their pursuit. Right. So he, you know, it might be Edgar Allan Poe that got you interested, but Hans Holzer was definitely part of why you pursued it, because he showed you that it could be pursued. There's lots of places, especially around here, that he's very, very famous for having investigated. This is a guy that spent 60 years doing this. So whether you agree with his interpretation or not, you cannot say that he didn't work hard. You know, he definitely did. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the other cases. So we talked about the Whaley House. And again, that's definitely something that's definitely a subject that I'm going to come up. He also did The Ghost of the Merchant's House, which is in New York City. And he did this in 1961. It is still considered to be one of the most consistently haunted places. And it's one of these places where the story is still there. The story is still very, very strong. But because people have known it to be haunted for so long, there seems to be, the haunting itself seems to be feeding the haunting itself, right? So people come in because it's haunted. They're very fortunate in that they also enter a really remarkable historic place. But it's also one of the few places where the owners of it, and I think it's actually owned by the state of New York at this point, acknowledge and support its haunting. So whether they believe in it or not, they say this place is purported to be haunted. We respect the spirits if they are here. And if you are here because of that, you're welcome to come. Not every place does that, you know, and they haven't switched into a fully commercial model for it. He also investigated, there's another place in New York, which Traci and I'm going to drag Traci to. It's the Morris Jumel Mansion. You might have heard about it.
Yes. I'm dying to go. No pun intended.
So one of the and we'll definitely go there. It is, again, a very, very famous historic place. And if you guys have seen or heard Hamilton, you're going to know that it's kind of famous for that as well. So there's a lot of stuff that was going on there. But he did do a fairly strenuous investigation there. If I remember correctly, he also caught a photo there. And if I can pull that up online, I'll definitely put that into our show notes. So, I
He's
mean,
got some great photos of some of these weird apparitions on old school film.
Yeah, and this was a guy. Yeah, this was a guy that was, he was using old school film. Film, and it was film. It wasn't glass plates. It's not something that you can look back on and say, well, the technology was there, but it was on film. And the Whaley House too. He caught. There's a handful of things that when I think of why did I become so interested in this subject matter. And there's a few photos that Holzer put out there where I really thought to myself, that is extremely difficult to not look at and say, yep, there's something there. And the Whaley House was one of them. And the Morris Jamel mansion was another one. The Morris Jamel mansion is kind of haunted in tandem with a place called One If by Land, which is a restaurant.
Yes.
I'm throwing that out. We're going.
It's gonna be on part of our our road trip.
Clinton Court, and these are Revolutionary War. These are places that were around prior to the Revolutionary War and during the Revolutionary War, but they're not necessarily haunted because of the Revolutionary War. They've just been preserved because of those. And the funny thing is if you talk about the Morris Jamel mansion specifically, it is far more famous now for its hauntings than for the fact that it was essentially the British headquarters during the time that the British were in New York. Which I'm not sure if that's a good thing or not, but it's an interesting thing. So I did think that when I think of Hans Holzer, I think of him as if we had a Mount Rushmore of certainly 20th century paranormalists, I think Holzer would earn a place up there, which is not to say that he was always accurate or that his motives were always as perfect as we might want them to be. He was making a living doing this. And although I tend to think his motives were pretty clear. I don't think he was misleading about that. And I do think he's, like I said, he didn't go in skeptically. He didn't go in with an attempt to disprove. He went in saying, I know this stuff exists, and if there is a ghost here who I can get information from, I'm going to do that. He really opened a lot of doors for, in particular, Western European and American middle-class people to suddenly, for it to be okay to pursue this. It was okay then to say, well, maybe there is something to this. You're not a hysterical housewife or a lunatic or uneducated or not intelligent, because here's somebody with kind of the educational chops. And he sounds good and he can sit on a stage and articulate these thoughts. And he did it for our subject. And so if there was a Mount Rushmore, I'm not sure who the other three would be. I can tell you who they wouldn't be, but we'll get into that. But
he's the Margaret Mead of dead people. No, but really, like he is going into this, group of people who are generally off limits to most of us, but a lot of people have a whisper of contact with and some curiosity, and he is studying them like they are a living population and saying, this is what I want you to understand. Right. This is what it's like for them. And this is what it's like to be among them.
Right. And
he's a sociologist of ghosts.
But what made him different than say the others, like Nandor Fodor, Nandor Fodor was very off-putting. People didn't like him. Holzer fit the scholarly stereotype that, in particular, Americans wanted. I remember lots of nights reading his stuff and being like, I gotta sleep with the lights on, and it wasn't because he told a scary story. It's because he illuminated a part of the human experience that I wasn't fully comfortable with, or, and he did that in such a way that to this day, it stays with me.
I think that's great. And let us know, are you familiar with Hans Holzer? Was this something that you are hearing for the first time, Kathy threw out some other names that were blasts from the past for us, like Sybil Leek, and certainly a variety of other places and people. Let us know what you think.
I would love for you guys to direct me into researching other people and other times, because to me, it's like visiting old friends. And so I hope you enjoyed this episode of Curious Explorers. And until we see you guys again, stay curious
and keep exploring.
Take care, you guys.
Listen.